everyone. This is Vivian Louie, Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm joined by our President, Adam Dameron, and our Senior Program Officer, Kim Dumont. Many thanks for tuning in today. You've joined part 2 of a 2-part webinar series on changing the conversation about inequality. How do we get to reducing inequality? First, a few words on who we are and what we do. The William T. Grant Foundation has 2 focus areas in grant making on youth outcomes. Our Use of Research Evidence initiative focuses on understanding ways to improve the role of research evidence in decision making. Our Reducing Inequality initiative was launched in 2014 and is the focus of this 2-part webinar series. The defining feature of the Reducing Inequality initiative is a focus on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. We intend to support research that helps us understand how programs, policies, and practices can mitigate the impact of inequality on young people in the United States. The goal of this 2-part webinar series is to share what we mean by response to inequality and to show how a research study can inform a response to inequality. Foundation staff, we've reviewed several hundred letters of inquiry to date. One of the things we realize is that researchers find it challenging to formulate a research study that addresses a response to inequality. This isn't surprising since social scientists are trained to describe the nature and extent of inequality along with its causes and consequences. While addressing a response to inequality is certainly related to this kind of effort, it's also qualitatively different. Our goal with this 2-part webinar series is to discuss what a response to inequality might look like in a research study on youth outcomes. To do that, we draw on papers commissioned by the Foundation on 4 topics, where we thought new directions for research on reducing inequality seemed imminent. Post-secondary education and workforce development, immigrant children and families, the justice systems for juveniles and young adults, and child and adolescent mental health. The authors of these papers each make the case that pursuing research along the lines they suggest could reverse recent trends in the rise of inequality. In our earlier June webinar, which is available on our website, we focused on post-secondary education and workforce development along with the justice. Today, we will focus on intersecting inequalities among immigrant origin children and youth and mental health services. But these topics certainly do not exhaust the many domains where research to reduce inequality can be focused. Our foundation is interested in supporting studies across a range of systems, including education, child welfare, justice, and mental health, and in varied settings, such as neighborhoods, schools, families, and communities. I also wanted to let you know what we will not address in today's webinar. I'm sure many of you have thoughtful questions about the process of applying for our major grants competition, such as what we fund and do not fund, how to write a letter of inquiry, when applications are due. These are all good questions, and we certainly have thoughtful answers to them available as other resources. We're providing these links in your chat box. Just as examples, you can consult the FAQs on our Foundation's website. A 2-part blog post I wrote on tips for writing a letter of inquiry for our Reducing Inequality initiative. If there's time later in the presentation, I'll briefly bring us back to these and additional important resources that you might find to be helpful. If you're joining us just now, I want to offer a technical reminder. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. You can certainly pose questions to the question inbox in the webinar system, and we'll respond to some of the questions you raise. But due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer them all. We've also found that the most reliable way to listen is on the phone. Let's turn to what we will address in today's webinar. First, I'll give a brief introduction to the Reducing Inequality initiative. Then I'll turn to 2 papers commissioned by the Foundation on how to make the transition from describing and understanding inequality to reducing inequality. I want to be clear, these are the author's recommendations for where we can go, not the foundation. The first paper is by psychologists Carola Suarez-Orozco, Hiro Yoshigawa, and Vivian Tseng. Vivian Tseng is our foundation's vice president of programs. This paper focuses on immigrant origin children and youth. What I'll do is briefly lay out the findings of that report. Then I'll spend some time discussing the research directions laid out in the report for reducing inequality and how they map onto the types of studies we typically fund. We'll then have some Q&A. I'll follow much of the same format for the paper by psychologists Margarita Alegria, Jennifer Greff-Green, Katie McLaughlin, and Stephen Loader on child and adolescent mental health and mental health services. But before we get started, I want to remind us again, the lines of further inquiry for reducing inequality suggested by these two papers are intended as illustrative examples. The examples are meant to stimulate, not end the conversation. We want your path-breaking ideas. All right, let's move forward. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we make a 4-point case for supporting research on reducing inequality among young people in the United States. Point 1, inequality is excessive. This is the case in many nations. That said, the Foundation's focus is the United States. Point 2, these high levels of inequality stand in the way of our economic and civic progress. Point 3, rising inequality is not a foregone conclusion. Our own history and that of other nations reveal many times when social policies have reduced inequality. Point 4, but to get there, we need new research to help us identify effective policies, programs, and practices. The key takeaway, there's certainly lots more to learn about what generates inequality. Enough to build a body of evidence on potential gap closers in youth outcomes. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we are convinced that social science research on youth development can play an important role in addressing the challenge of inequality. Several hallmarks define our Foundation's approach to build evidence on potential gap closers in youth outcomes. First, we focus on young people ages 5 to 25. Second, although we recognize that no single study will lead to major changes, we intend for the studies we fund to culminate in approaches that reduce inequality. That is why we prioritize programs, policies, and practices. So studies may focus on how inequality can be reduced by implementing a program, policy, or practice. Studies may also address a key dilemma that practitioners or policymakers face in addressing unequal youth outcomes, or challenge assumptions that underlie current approaches. Finally, our portfolio is broadly interdisciplinary, drawing on ideas and tools from sociology, psychology, and beyond. So let's see how this approach might look like in studies of immigrant origin children and youth. First, there's a clear problem along a dimension of inequality that is of interest to the Foundation. As Carola Suarez-Orozco and her co-authors point out, this is a substantial and growing portion of our youth population. They are a diverse group whose development has occurred amid rising social and economic inequality. The authors want to understand immigrant youth developmental and educational outcomes by looking at intersecting sources of inequality. Some of these sources can change pre- and post-migration. For instance, a parent who's highly educated in the home country may suffer a decline in employment post-migration. The authors argue that the following intersecting sources of inequality are especially challenging: generation and newcomer status. The first generation is defined as foreign-born. The second generation is born in the United States. Both have immigrant-born parents. Racialization. 89% of immigrants in the United States are from Latin America, Asia, Africa, Oceania, or the Caribbean. Racialization can present many obstacles, from workplace and housing discrimination to physical and mental toll. Language barriers. 81% of immigrant youth have parents who speak English and another language at home. Dual language learners have cognitive and socio-emotional advantages over single language children. But at the same time, English language learner, or ELL students, fare worse than non-ELLs in a number of educational outcomes. Undocumented status. Children with undocumented parents who are here without legal authorization to be here. These children make up 1/3 of all immigrant origin youth. Undocumented status, whether the parents or the children themselves, is associated with children's developmental risk, including lower cognitive development in children and anxiety and depression in adolescents. What does this mean for research on reducing inequalities in immigrant youth outcomes? To be clear, our foundation is not interested in funding studies about the link between immigrant family socioeconomic status, pre- and post-migration, and a child's well-being. As important as that inquiry is, it does not take us close enough towards reducing inequality. Building on what is already known about the nature, extent, and drivers of inequality, Suara Zarasco and colleagues proposed new directions for research that would take us towards reducing inequality. These suggested directions map onto the different types of studies that we commonly fund in this initiative. Within the Reducing Inequality Initiative, we support different types of studies, including descriptive studies, meant to clarify the mechanisms for reducing inequality. One could develop a descriptive study that examines community and family practices and resources that are linked to positive outcomes among immigrant origin youth. The study's findings may inform new avenues for developing programs or policies to reduce inequalities for immigrant origin youth. We also fund intervention studies that examine attempts to reduce inequality. One could develop a study that evaluates the effectiveness of an intervention designed to strengthen peer relationships. The goal would be to help understand what can reduce inequality among immigrant origin youth or between immigrant origin and other youth. Another type of study could evaluate whether policies, such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals Memorandum, or DACA, have reduced existing inequalities. Policies like these provide short-term reprieves from deportation, access to Social Security numbers, and legal work status for some without documentation status. And we fund studies that improve the measurement of inequality in ways that will enhance the work of researchers, practitioners, or policymakers. Data on immigrant backgrounds needs to be more routinely collected in district, state, and national data sets, as well as in evaluation studies. Generation of immigration has not been collected in the decennial census since 1970, or in most school district data sets. Surveys still tend to use aggregated data, and we know that more nuanced measures are needed. One could also develop a study that broadens our measures of youth outcomes from a narrow focus on educational level to include developmental outcomes for youth of different ages. Again, though, I want to remind us that these lines of further research suggested by the authors are meant as illustrative examples. We want your best ideas. So on that note, let's hear from you.
Vivian, we've got a number of questions from our listeners. One that came in early on before we had even started was about critical race theory. This is a question about whether critical race theory can be used to frame a problem of inequality.
Thank you, Adam. What a thoughtful question that you brought to the table. So our answer is basically we do not presuppose any conceptual framework that applicants bring to their work. What we are concerned about is that the work informs a response inequality.
Adam, I have a question for you. Some folks are wondering if we are only interested in the papers and issues that are being discussed today, or if we're interested in issues of inequality more broadly.
Yes, our interests are broader than those topics being discussed today. We thought this was an excellent chance to illustrate our interest in a couple of key examples. But as we explain on our website, we are interested in inequality in economic, social, behavioral, and academic outcomes, and especially interested in inequality on the base of race or ethnicity, income or socioeconomic status, immigrant origins, or language minority status. So this gives a pretty broad range of domains in which we might be interested in new research on reducing inequality.
Great.
Well, Kim, I'll throw one back at you then. This is a question about the Officers Research Grant.
Okay.
One of our listeners is asking whether it might be possible to get an Officers Research Grant to evaluate program theory as it relates to reducing inequality as a prelude then for a subsequent larger grant proposal on reducing inequality.
Another great question. The short answer is absolutely. Since we're interested in studies that inform programs, policies, and practices to reduce inequality, evaluating theories and trying to identify mechanisms for reducing inequality fall right in our interest. What we look for in an Officers Research Award is that it can stand on its own legs, which we usually define as having its own product, so that we can see something at the end of that investment. But certainly people can use what they learn from those smaller research awards to inform a larger study.
Vivian, one of our listeners has asked whether we would fund comparative research between U.S. and developing countries focusing on reducing inequality.
Thank you, Adam, for bringing another great question to the table. So we fund studies on youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. We would be open to considering a comparative study for the U.S. portion of the study, so long as it meets that criteria.
And a related question, suppose I'm a Canadian researcher working in a Canadian research institution, but the focus of my research is on young people in the United States. Would I be eligible for funding?
Yes.
Here's a question that I think it was really answered by your slides, but it comes up so often that I'll just bring it up so you can reiterate. Are we mostly interested in funding intervention studies, or do we support other kind of work?
Another great question. I'm glad you bring it to the table. We definitely are interested in a wide range of work, descriptive studies, intervention, and measurement studies being among them.
We also have some questions about whether folks need to submit an application for a freestanding study, or if the monies that they apply for us to supplement other research funding and grant programs they have to focus more specifically either on the mechanisms that are at play in reducing inequality or other outcomes that relate to reducing inequality. And I'll just take this one myself and say that we certainly welcome requests for proposals that build on or leverage other research projects that are already underway, as long as the part that's being proposed is consistent with our focus area on reducing inequality.
Vivian, I've got a question for you from one of our listeners. Do we fund nonprofits working to reduce inequality in addition to our funding for university scholars who are studying the reduction of inequality?
So we fund research that would inform our response to reducing inequality. You could certainly, if you were a researcher, partner with a nonprofit organization that works in those efforts, or conversely, if you as an applicant are the nonprofit, you could partner with the researcher towards that goal.
Thanks. Kim, here's a question for you. Could this funding mechanism be used as a supplement to an existing intervention grant, perhaps from another source, to collect additional outcomes data that might be related to reducing inequality?
Yes, we just addressed this question a minute ago, and I thank you for bringing it up again. Just to be clear, that We certainly welcome research applications that are supplements on larger ongoing studies, either to extend them, to dig more deeply to understand mechanisms, or to expand the outcomes that are being looked at. All of those are welcome.
Okay, I hope this isn't a repeat. Do we fund longitudinal studies with multiple parts?
Sure. Again, our funding range for the Reducing Inequality Initiative runs from $100,000 to $600,000. Often people take a 2 to 3 year span to do that work, but one could imagine it could extend longer, let's say 4 years, or build on a project that's already underway. Adam, I had one question for you that came up, where folks were wondering, as we learn from our research studies, these findings, what do we do with them to assist in reducing inequalities ourselves?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kim, and thank you to the listener who posed it. I think it's a really important one. We are engaged in a variety of communications efforts. One of our priorities at the Foundation is enhancing the visibility of the work we fund so that it can make a real difference in the long run. We recognize that no single study is likely to be transformative, but we hope that the work over time will accumulate to point in real directions that can lead to reducing inequality. And so we are engaged with people in the policy world. This connects up with our other work, our other main priority, which is on the use of research evidence in decision making. We are supportive of and engaged in research practice partnerships where evidence can feed into the decision process. And so I hope that the work we support on reducing inequality will provide content for those relationships.
Great. Okay, great. What a terrific set of questions. Thank you for sharing them, Kim and Adam, and all of you, of course, who were relaying the questions to them. So now let's turn to the report by Margarita Alegria and her colleagues on mental health and mental health services. Mental health care is one of the fastest areas of spending growth in child health care. Most psychiatric disorders have an onset in childhood or adolescence, increasing the risk for poor outcomes later in life. While the occurrence of mental health disorders varies by race and ethnicity, the authors point out that few studies have examined the mechanisms that underlie these gaps and strategies to reduce them. Similar to Swarzarowsko, Alegria and her colleagues outlined 4 possible sources of inequalities in mental health use outcomes that need greater attention. One is low socioeconomic status, as measured by low educational level and income. Again, similar to the immigration report, Alegria and her colleagues suggest an intersectional approach. This kind of intersectional approach sees socioeconomic status as interacting with a number of other social and environmental factors to cause disparity. For instance, the authors highlight perceptions of one's status in society. These perceptions of subjective social status are associated with mental health, independent of income or education. Individual level attributes such as ethnicity and race, education, income, generational status. These attributes are not only outward markers of social status, they are also factors in determining how the individual understands one's social location in society. Although clearly important, measures commonly used to operationalize social positions, such as income, education, occupation, and class, these measures do not encompass the range of sociocultural factors associated with perceived social position. The effect of income and perceived social status on mental health outcomes might differ by race and by ethnicity. Other sources of inequalities include adversities encountered in childhood, such as maltreatment or family violence, family structure, This includes single motherhood, divorce, paternal involvement, and neighborhood factors. Who lives in the neighborhood? How stable it is over time, the degree to which it is segregated, and along what lines. It is clear that economic, along with racial and ethnic inequalities, exist in child and youth mental health outcomes. What Alegria and her colleagues push us on is this, that in order to be successful at reducing inequality, we need to know more about some of the mechanisms at play. So researchers should identify and test strategies for reducing inequalities in mental health outcomes. This will require clear conceptual models about why income and race matter for mental health outcomes and what might be done about it. By way of example, the authors call for an analysis of incentives for preventive mental health care and screening for minority and low-income youth. To what extent would such an approach reduce racial and ethnic differences in who seeks care or detecting potential mental health problems? This approach also has the potential to reduce some of the stresses associated with being poor or low income. The authors also suggest that more research is needed to identify periods of development beyond early childhood that play a large role for mental health. This research could identify which factors are more important at specific points of development. Cultural factors, self-perceived social status, and perception of racial and ethnic discrimination. All these may become increasingly important as a child ages. Yet we know little about the age at which these factors usually become important in a child's sense of self and how they relate to mental health. This detailed knowledge may inform new preventive efforts throughout childhood and adolescence that could be adapted based on a child's profile of risk and protective factors. The authors also call out the well-documented research link between neighborhood conditions, social resources, and mental health outcomes. Such research suggests that targeting neighborhood conditions is a means of reducing inequalities in youth mental health outcomes. But research on actual strategies to improve neighborhoods and thus youth outcomes is lacking and ripe for further research. As for the provider side mechanisms of mental health disparities, the authors suggest research on ethnic matching between children and young people and their providers. Researchers have found that ethnic matching between adults and their providers improves trust and communication and can lead to better treatment outcomes. What is this relationship for minority youth and children? And what can providers do to improve treatment outcomes? Again, I want to be clear. These, along with several others, are the author's thoughtful recommendations for where we can go. You may have an idea in these topic areas, or you may not. But the important thing is we want your best idea. So again, let's hear from you.
Vivian, I have a question for you from one of our listeners. This listener is really asking a question about whether we fund program evaluation. The listener asks whether we fund research that examines existing prevention programs that hope to reduce inequality, and then clarifies it by saying, what's our stance on funding program evaluation?
Terrific question, Adam. Thank you. So yes, we do fund proposed evaluation studies. These proposed evaluation studies need to specify a theoretical basis for the program, the policy, or the practice, enhance understanding of its effects. So this may include considering the mechanisms through which effects occur or variations in the effect, in intervention effects. So we're interested in studies that shed light not solely on what works, but on what works for whom, under what conditions, and why.
Adam, building on an earlier question that we had about how we use what we learn from the research, there's someone who would like to know who we see as the primary audience for the research that we conduct. Are they academics? Are they practice-oriented folks like policymakers, or some combination of these?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Kim, thank you for giving me the chance to address it. Well, we support research. So I would say that researchers are always an audience for the work that we support. Beyond that, however, it varies. Some of the studies we work have a strong component that's addressed to a policy or practice audience. Others are primarily focused on getting academic papers into the research literature. And we don't take a position on which of those stands is essential. We do ask applicants to spell out what they see as the audience and to identify their plan for communicating their findings. But researchers that we support use a range of strategies for doing so.
Great. Is it also fair to say that we put more weight on building a body of research evidence or contributing to that rather than putting the weight on a single study and its potential to change a conversation?
Yes, thank you. I agree. Vivian, here's another question from a listener. Our website mentioned our interest in inequality on the basis of race or ethnicity, income or socioeconomic status, and immigrant origins or language minority status. What about inequality by gender?
Another terrific question. Thank you. Certainly, we would appreciate research on disparities in other areas, including gender. But the applicants have to make a compelling case that this research will improve youth outcomes.
Does this also hold true? We have somebody who's wondering if we fund research on youth with intellectual or developmental disability.
Yes, the answer would be the same. Thank you, Kim.
From what I've seen, applications that get into some of these other domains might be most compelling if they looked at the intersection among domains. For example, today's paper emphasized the dramatic racial disparities in incarceration among girls. And that would be inequality in the justice system on the basis of race and gender. So that might be a way of making this a compelling.
Okay. We appreciate all your great questions. And so let's continue. We're nearing the close of today's webinar and our two-part webinar series. But before we close, I want to call out several resources on our foundation website that you might find to be helpful. Adam Gamron, who you've been hearing from, our president, has written an essay entitled Inequality is the Problem, Prioritizing Research on Reducing Inequality in our 2013 annual report. You might also look at our 6 commission papers on inequality across different domains, and the links are in your chat box right now. For insights on the grant application process, you might consult our 2014 webinar on the major grants competitions, a 2-part blog post I wrote with tips for writing a letter of inquiry for reducing inequality, and our research application guide, which we will be refreshing soon. Finally, some upcoming dates. If you think your interest fit hours in the Reducing Inequality Initiative, we look forward to receiving your letters of inquiry, the first step in our grants process. The next deadlines are January 12th, 2016 at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time and May 5th, 2016 at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. In the meantime, just spread the word, reducing inequality. Thank you for tuning in today.